Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the final webinar in the 2024 OSHA webinar series at Con Maciel Carey. I'm delighted to join you today with a host of my colleagues for a really interesting topic. Right, we're about 4 years into the Biden administration. We understand what's going on. This is where we've gotten into our comfort zone, and now we are shaken right out of it as we move into a new era. As we move into January, we will see the inauguration of President Trump for a second term, non-consecutive term. It's an interesting and unusual course in American history, but that's going to mean significant change, and probably as much or more than anything, significant change in the administrative state, what the executive agencies look like. And in our very narrow slice worldview of OSHA, it means potentially major changes. And so we've been sitting around the water cooler, partners here at Con Maciel Carey, and talking about, what does this mean for OSHA? What does it mean for OSHA enforcement? What does it mean for OSHA rulemaking? Everything that we do on a day-to-day basis is probably about to change. And if you're logged in today, then that means this touches you professionally in some way. And so we're going to do our best today to look into the crystal ball and talk a little bit about what we can expect from OSHA during a second term of the Trump administration. And we'll just very briefly introduce ourselves, because we've got a big group today. I'm Eric Kahn. I'm one of the founding partners at Con Maciel Carey, and I chair the firm's national OSHA practice out of our Washington, D.C. office. And I'm pleased to be joined by so many of my colleagues today. I'll let you guys all introduce yourselves.
I'll start since I'm in the room. I like your left-hand man today. Aaron Gelb, one of the firm's co-managing partners based in Chicago, lead the Midwest OSHA practice. We should probably comment on our attire. Eric and I spent the morning at a client site, which is why we are more casual than usual.
Yeah, or we were packing up because maybe there's no more OSHA and we are looking for other work. I don't know. One of those two.
Kate?
I can follow you all. I was not at a client site this morning, so I'm dressed appropriately for the office. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate McMahon, and know many of you in the audience, and look forward to talking to you about what we expect over the next 4 years.
And I'm Rachel Kahn. I'm chair of the California practice, and one of the things we'll be talking about today is what to expect from Cal OSHA and some of the other state plans, as we probably will see a decrease at the federal level.
And hello,
we're going to let Scott do a proper introduction, because this is the first time Scott is introducing himself to our audience at the OSHA webinar series as a member of Con Maciel Carey. So I hope everyone joins us in welcoming Scott. And who are you, Scott?
Yes, thanks. I'm a senior counsel here in our DC office. Despite not being a partner, they let me around the water cooler for these conversations. I'm dressed to perform accounting work, I guess. I don't know, but here we are. I came to Con Maciel from another firm, a large international firm where I did a lot of workplace safety, as well as some other DOL-related enforcement activity and government relations and policy work. Prior to that, I spent almost a dozen years at the Department of Labor as a trial attorney, and then as a national office attorney in the Occupational Safety and Health Division of the Solicitor's Office, as well as doing some details with the Wage and Hour Division in non-lawyer, more strategic policy roles. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm excited to be with the group today to chat about what we can expect in the next administration.
So I think our plan today is a little bit different than our typical webinar. We sort of viewed this as maybe a roundtable discussion. We've got slides because it's in our nature to do that. I can't do one of these things without slides, but those are sort of markers for a discussion. But we're going to just kind of brainstorm. This is the water cooler that we're sitting around and talking together about what we think is next for OSHA in terms of personnel, enforcement, rulemaking, and then what the states might do in response to major changes at the federal level. And I think Scott is going to sort of lead the discussion and keep us moving along. And I'll let you kick us off here.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So we wanted to first talk about, anticipated leadership at the department. There, it's obviously interesting, to think about who may be leading the Department of Labor as a whole, and then, of course, serving as Assistant Secretary for OSHA. There is a nominee for Secretary of Labor, and that is Oregon Representative Lori Chavez DeRemer. She lost a narrow reelection bid, so she remains in Congress, as we were talking about before, for a little bit longer until the turnover, and then she'll kind of look to her former peers for potential confirmation. She is known as the most pro-union Republican in Congress. I'll let you come up with your own analogy for what the most pro-union Republican in Congress is like. But I'll say that AFL-CIO tracked her voting on 10 bills that were impacting employees and found she voted against working people on 9 of them. So that being pro-union and pro-worker maybe aren't exactly aligned, but I don't know that we are expecting a huge pro-worker move from the administration that repeatedly self-described as the most union-friendly in history, that being the Biden administration. She also, her rating was about 10% for AFL-CIO, from the AFL-CIO when it came to support for workers, and average Republicans are at about 6%, and Democrats are at 99. So, there's probably still some daylight between her policies and, even centrist Democrats. But I think nonetheless, it was sort of a surprising pick for folks, given that she has so much union support and given that she has supported things like the PRO Act, which I think, one of the big pieces, and guys, feel free to jump in, but I think one of the big pieces that the business community pushes back on with the PRO Act is the ABC test. And maybe Rachel can speak to that, being from California, but the ABC test, they wanted to amend, the PRO Act would amend the NLRA to incorporate the ABC test for determining worker status, employment status. Now that's not necessarily, it's not, NLRA isn't a DOL statute, but the ABC test was one of the big issues that I'd say probably torpedoed or hindered Acting Secretary Julie Sue's confirmation process because of perceived support, her perceived support of the ABC test. She is from California, so of course she must support it. She did, as to be fair. So I don't want to mislead anyone, but she also repeatedly stated that she couldn't make that change without congressional action. She and the Solicitor of Labor under Biden, both Seema Nanda, both repeated that statement. Nonetheless, that support was not appreciated by business interests, the business community, and others. And she's been kind of languishing, and now will serve out the time as the acting secretary rather than receiving Senate confirmation at any point. I don't know if folks have any more thoughts on Rep. Chavez DeRemer.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and somebody raised this as a question, I think her confirmation is not a sure thing because of that, right? I mean,
right.
I think Trump is doing what he needs to do to try to get all of his people confirmed, and even some, I would say more questionable nominees for other reasons outside of their policies. So I'm not going to, suggest that anybody is unlikely to get confirmed, but I think her confirmation path is perhaps murkier than others because of that. But I think, Scott makes a good point. Like everything I've read, you read these articles and you would think, my gosh, Trump just nominated Bernie Sanders as labor secretary. She is no Bernie Sanders, like by a million miles, but she is, relatively pro-union, and being relatively pro-union muddies the water, I think, for her confirmation.
And
Hey, you had a thought?
if I could just add one share something, none of us really know what's going to happen here. But I will tell you that we're hearing a lot from the unions and the Democratic side that is a gigantic collective sigh of relief about this nominee. So I think, notwithstanding her support for the PRO Act, she is likely to be, and again, we're just at this point reading tea leaves, and we could all be wrong, but I suspect she will be one of the easier nominees to be confirmed by this administration.
Because some Democrats will vote to confirm.
That's right.
Yeah,
They
great.
could not have, from what I'm hearing, they couldn't have a better choice, and they could have had a lot, from their perspective, worser choices.
Yeah. And so, I think the reason why we start with this discussion, the reason why we start with this particular nomination and this slide is that, this is the person who will steer the ship at labor for all kinds of different laws, all kinds of different agencies. We're talking about OSHA. If this labor secretary is relatively pro-worker, relatively pro-labor, I should say, pro-union, I think that portends that she would be, somewhat centrist on issues like OSHA and worker safety, whereas you might see someone on the more extreme end who wants to take the hatchet to OSHA, who is all about deregulation, who is all about scaling back enforcement in extreme ways. Maybe we don't see that at labor, right? The nominee, if we were talking about EPA right now, we'd be having a different conversation. But maybe labor experiences a slightly less of a pendulum swing because of this nominee. So that's why we've started here, and it bears watching.
But I think we've all worked on cases in the last few years that were significant enough that they were on Julie Sue's desk,
right? And
she weighed in on the most significant enforcement actions and presumably obviously greenlit them, since we're defending them now. So that having Chavez DeRemer in that seat, I think, increases the likelihood that those significant enforcement actions proceed, maybe not exactly the same, but proceed more likely than if there was an extreme anti-enforcement mindset in that chair.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
And I was just going to add, she being from the West Coast and being from Oregon, will likely have some potential influence on her that she'll bring from Washington. So it's a different, it's a kind of a West Coast, and Oregon's not as, progressive as a state as you would see in California or Washington, but it certainly is up there. And so, I think that we'll see a little bit of influence on her policies from what she brings from the West Coast.
Yeah, definitely. And so I moved to the next slide just because we had started talking about OSHA in particular, and how resources may look and those kinds of things. I mean, when it came to the first Trump administration, there was actually no assistant secretary for OSHA. No one was ever confirmed. There was a nominee who lingered for a while, and then withdrew shortly before. I think he was about to get a vote for unknown reasons to me, but maybe you guys know the scuttlebutt on that better than I do. Lauren Sweat was serving sort of in multiple roles under multiple titles that eventually landed as the principal deputy assistant secretary. And she was effectively running the agency, but without that gravitas of Senate confirmation. And I think sometimes when you're in the government, that kind of lack of confirmed leadership can lead to questions about responsibilities and roles and how much you can actually do, whether or not, those are justified concerns. It does seem like, and don't get me wrong, the agencies move forward under acting secretaries or under acting leadership of subdivisions, but that Senate confirmation means something, or else we wouldn't have it in our Constitution. So, we'll see what happens with the second Trump administration. We do know, obviously, leadership positions at OSHA and with the department more generally were promptly filled under the Biden administration. Doug Parker, the current assistant secretary, came from Cal OSHA that Rachel just sort of alluded to, which is I'll say one of the more active state plans, just to, euphemistically put it from a management attorney perspective. And so, they came in very serious about OSHA, about safety, and demonstrated that through action. You'll see we have an ellipsis there for the 2025 Trump nominee. I'm sure each of us has heard, and I know we've discussed some possible folks who could land in that chair. But there hasn't, to my knowledge, been anyone in particular named to this point. And obviously, that person, we don't know how much President Trump is talking to Secretary nominee about, hey, who do you know in this space? Do you have anybody you could recommend, or where he's getting kind of all his thoughts and his ideas for folks in these roles. Again, it was a corporate side. Scott Mugno was the name of the person last time. He was corporate, safety person previously, and so you could anticipate there might be a business lean, right, to the way he approached things. With Chavez DeRemer being, coming from Congress and having a bit of a union background, we don't know, maybe, and we'll talk more about how this could play into the pending regulations and recent final regulations as we move forward in the presentation. But, what impacts does she have, or what impacts will her philosophy have on OSHA in particular? I don't know if anyone has thoughts on where they see this going.
Think just to as much as I hate to bring back the pleasant memories of the pandemic, but remember when President Biden was taking office, right? It was at the height of a global pandemic with a vaccine that was coming online. And so, as we always talk about, that OSHA was mentioned on day one, after, I think, of President Biden's term, and Jim Frederick was in place on day one. Yeah. So I certainly don't expect that in President Trump's first day in office that he's going to be focused on OSHA.
Right. Yeah. One thing I would say is this first bullet on this slide is what makes our discussion today harder than it probably would be for any other agency that we could be having this discussion about. Usually by a second term of a president, you've got a pretty clear picture of what their priorities are at any executive agency, what their action plan is, the kind of people that will be making the decisions at those agencies. But the fact that we went that first full term without a confirmed head of the agency leaves this a little bit in the dark, right? The career folks got to not run amok, but maybe have a lot more influence than they ordinarily would in a Republican administration.
I was there running amok. Totally. So.
Still running amok.
Yeah, totally. I was so amok.
But that's what makes this a little bit of a there's more uncertainty about what we might see at OSHA in a second term, because I presume that we are going to have a confirmed assistant secretary at some point this go around. And then I think OSHA will look quite different than it did during President Trump's first term. So we can't look to the last term to say, well, we know what OSHA is going to do under Trump. We have some idea, but it's less clear than I'm sure it would be at EPA or other agencies. That's my one takeaway on this point. The other takeaway I would say is on the last day of the Trump administration first term, OSHA had the fewest number of compliance officers and the most vacancies in area offices, in regional offices, in the agency's entire history. And the last 4 years, the highest priority at OSHA has been to rebuild those ranks. They've done that pretty effectively. And so I think we probably can look to and expect that trend will continue, that the budget gets squeezed, that there is not an urgency to fill positions that become vacant in the ordinary course, and that we will probably see a much smaller staff at agency in 4 years than we have today, just like we saw the last go around. And that has a big impact on what we're going to talk about right now, OSHA enforcement.
Yeah, and Eric, you sort of segued for us there, so I wanted to move on to our next topic so we keep moving forward, because I know we got a lot to cover. But I know you and Aaron are going to kind of take the lead on guiding us through a conversation of what we might expect from OSHA enforcement. You sort of started laying the groundwork with the resource issues. So
yeah. Yeah, and that's, and I think that's something that we can reasonably expect, regardless of what we saw the last go round, is the budget is likely to be cut or at least modified, or at least be flat. I think best case scenario for OSHA is that their budget is flat for the next 4 years, but it is also quite likely, with the influence of Doge and things like that we'll talk about in a little bit of detail, that there are big budget cuts. And I think as a result of that, just by virtue of a smaller agency, just by virtue of fewer enforcement resources, I think it is a reasonable expectation that enforcement will decline, just from a raw, data standpoint. On the next slide, I think we've got some data around, and numbers of inspections, numbers of significant enforcement actions, press releases, things like that. And I think one of the things that was interesting was during the Trump administration, I think we can kind of ignore 2020, right? If you look at that and say, oh my gosh, like Trump really slashed, the numbers of inspections, really slashed the number of significant enforcement actions. That was that, bizarro year where COVID was in full effect. OSHA, like the whole rest of the world, was trying to figure out, how do we do our job? And then they were focused really in a major way on, developing policies, developing guidance, not doing rulemaking in 2020, but maybe thinking about doing rulemaking. So I think we can ignore that. But one thing you can see, though, is numbers of inspections sort of stayed flat. But we know from our friends at OSHA, and looking at sort of a more granular look at the data, OSHA was sort of reverted to doing what we call a cup of coffee inspection. Maybe you get 5 or 6 inspections on one visit to a construction site that takes 2 hours, as opposed to a more comprehensive process safety management inspection or general duty clause enforcement matter. But you could see the real data was on the size of the enforcement actions. As the Trump administration sort of settled in, you saw what had been a pretty steady trend in increases in significant enforcement leveled off in the middle of the Trump administration. Even as OSHA's penalty authority climbed every year, we weren't seeing more significant enforcement. And then look at, now we transition on this chart on the bottom left to the Biden administration, huge jumps in significant enforcement actions year over year. I think it's a reasonable forecast that either levels off or declines. And my expectation is a decline, because these were really and we'll update this in a few months, with what 2024 looked like, really extraordinary period of very aggressive, very high dollar enforcement, bunch of new policies we'll talk about in a little bit as well, that naturally drive up enforcement, that those things I think will decline in a major way. And I think that's something that we can expect to see. I'm confident in my prediction in that regard, that whether it's lower resources or just a different philosophy, we'll see a decline in those ways. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the specific policies or anything else on enforcement.
I mean, I think one of the things that I'm going to be interested to see is what happens to the emphasis programs, right? We've seen a significant growth in emphasis programs over the last 4 years. That proactive enforcement or proactive approach to getting into facilities, crunching the data, figuring out where the hazards are, developing an emphasis program, and then getting out and both doing the random inspection or the inspections off the randomly generated lists, as well as expanding inspections. So you knew if you were covered by a NEP, REP, LEP, and they come out for any other reason, they're going to expand, and often those emphasis programs are far more comprehensive. The amputation emphasis program here in Illinois, the food manufacturing local emphasis program. So I would be surprised to see any or certainly not many new emphasis programs. The questions that I'm curious to is, will they just rescind emphasis programs that were recently launched? We're doing a lot of work in the Kansas City region, preparing for regional grain emphasis program. Do they pull that? I think in talking to some former officials, I think we can certainly see them take a look at an inventory of all emphasis programs, identify those that are where not many inspections are taking place, and probably pulling those and streamlining the number of emphasis programs. here in Illinois, this food emphasis program has been apparently very, very well received within the agency, and there was discussions about expanding that on a national basis. That's not going to happen in my view. So I think that's particularly interesting. I don't know if you want to talk about the IBI or.
Well, I would just say on the emphasis program issue, that was something I was eager to monitor the last Trump administration, and it didn't change, right? We went from very few emphasis programs to a huge number at the end of the Obama administration. So we're sitting there saying, oh, well, surely they're going to pare all those things back, and they didn't. And part of that to me was those are big kind of policy type decisions that without an assistant secretary, we didn't see that change. So I don't think that is necessarily predictive for this go around, because I do expect eventually there will be a confirmed head of OSHA. And so I do think we will see more major policy decisions like that are driven from the political appointees that we didn't see the last go around. But that's a great flag for what to expect from enforcement is what happens with the emphasis programs.
Just one more note before we sort of move to streamlining that Aaron kind of pointed to. On the slide where we have press releases, it may not be immediately obvious why that's on this enforcement slide, but I'll say that's been something that the Obama administration, obviously you can see the numbers there, and the Biden administration have used. Either you could call it deterrence, you could call it public shaming. It depends how you approach it. But these press releases are issued, if they're issued, and we see that it decreased under the first Trump administration, in a way to sort of further the impact of an inspection. Even, we're talking about resource limitations, even under Democratic administrations, there are resource limitations that don't allow OSHA to cover every facility that's under its jurisdiction, right? So to broaden that reach, they may push something out that says, hey, look at this high value, big, violation recovery we got through this inspection. You don't want this to be you next time, folks in the same industry. So, read about our press release and, oh, everyone will be scared into compliance, right? It is a big deal. The reach of the government is probably broader, no matter how large your company is, than your communications department, not to cast aspersions on your individual communications departments, but it is the government. They have pretty broad reach. And so when these narratives get out there, even if you have us come in and secure you complete vindication, as we can do, all the time. I'm kidding. I'm not representing that at all. We come in and we do the best we can.
Results may vary.
Results may vary. Eric Kahn did not approve the contents of Scott's message. But when you come in, you get a better result, you're able to resolve it, settle, whatever the case may be, you're not getting a second government press release that talks about the realities of the outcome. And so it's really that first story that gets out there, first mover that's out there. And we may see that decrease just in a way to we're just looking at traditionally Republicans, and I'm saying we're not going into a traditional Republican administration, but traditionally Republican administrations have, reduced the use of press releases and that kind of public shaming. So again, just wanted to point out why that fell on this slide and sort of the use that we've seen.
There was a period of time during the Trump administration, I think it was like the first 8 or 9 months, where they issued 0 press releases.
Yeah.
So that is not an extreme idea or prediction that there may be 0 enforcement press releases. If that's a decision that some policymaker in this administration wants to make, there's some precedent for it, and we saw it for quite a significant period of time the first go around. So that's
certainly until somebody is confirmed, right?
Yeah.
So that could be that no one wants to go out on that limb and green light that press release. I think if you're going to see press releases, right, it's going to be more matter of fact, just the facts of what happened, the citation, not the like pulling of the heartstrings or the ad hominem attacks that you often see. And I think you would see press releases probably more so on employers that the administration believes are true bad actors, perhaps fewer press releases on the novel issues. Workplace violence press release, for example, may be less likely, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we did talk a little bit about streamlining. I know we've talked about resources, but I think, we'd be remiss if we did not mention the newest department of the government. That's not actually a department, but the Department of Government Efficiency. I don't, Eric, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. We mentioned the first bullet, I'll just say Project 2025 includes a suggestion that 10.9 billion, which was fiscal year 2020, that request would provide a workable target for reductions. Right now, I think the budget for DOL is around 13.8, 13.9. So that's more than a 20% decrease for an agency that is constantly claiming underfunding. So that's a real impact if Project 2025, which I understand no one has actually read or heard of, would get implemented. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is context and background, right? It is not an actual agency. Their authority is basically to write a report, a blue ribbon report making recommendations. But it is, it doesn't take a whole lot of interpretation to understand what the goal is, right? I mean, this is President Trump talking about his DOGE initiative, saying that this initiative will pave the way for my administration to dismantle government bureaucracy, to slash excess regulations, to cut wasteful spending, and restructure federal agencies. That's the goal. Whether it comes about because of DOGE, whether it comes about because of the Project 2025, President Trump is in charge of the executive branch, and his goal is to shrink government in a significant way. And this is, and he's going to take advice from Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy on this effort that they are going to undertake. I think within the next year and a half, was it by early 2026, their work will be done, or sometime in 2025. And these are the kinds of goals that Elon and Vivek have been talking about, are to cut, depending on which day you ask them, cut 500 billion or 2 trillion from annual federal spending. We're talking about, Department of Labor and OSHA in particular is such a small budget agency. These kinds of cuts could have an extraordinary impact on what the agency is capable of doing. And so that bears watching. You hear all kinds of talk about cutting headcount, which is what we talked about at the very beginning of this. You cut headcount, you have a big influence on what OSHA is capable of doing, whether it's rulemaking or enforcement. And they're talking about mass headcount reductions across the federal bureaucracy. Regardless of how that comes about, I think it is clear that that is a goal, and they have all the levers to be able to make that goal become a reality. So I think it is a realistic expectation that OSHA will be smaller in 4 years than it is today, and that impacts all the business that they would endeavor to undertake. So
there are two really passive pathways at the start, I think, or they're not passive, but they're not overly active. The federal government can be an older workforce, and there are going to be plenty of people who are eligible for retirement who will, either early or regular, and will go walk out the door for a number of reasons, and won't be backfilled, right? And then the other piece is a lot of us have grown comfortable with remote work. And that was a sort of, for me, welcome change from the pandemic, but people have different views on it. And I believe, Musk and Ramaswamy have suggested that's something that's, off the table kind of almost immediately. And so if remote work for federal workers, if everyone's called back to their home bases, but they used to work in the Francis Perkins building, which I did, lovely place. And now they live in Denver or Boulder or California, on the beaches of San Diego. It may not be something they want to run back and do. And that could be just another way to sort of weed people out and not provide replacements. And so even before you get to the point of, okay, how do we get rid of underperformers? How do we change the Civil Service Protection Act? How do we do all those things? You have some initial less controversial steps that a lot of people, I think a lot of people probably won't be against saying government workers should be in the office at least more than a day a week, full 5. Some people will broach it or, won't appreciate that requirement. And I think it could impact numbers more significantly than, people are necessarily talking about right now.
Yep.
So moving on from Doge, I think we covered some of this, but again, the sort of changing enforcement philosophy. I think you mentioned instance by instance, just by name a little bit, Eric, but I don't know if you want to talk about kind of what that is and where you see that going along with the SVEP program.
Yeah, we put this in here because these were, if you go to the next slide, you can see a little bit more background about this. These were two, I think, game changer policy changes that OSHA implemented over the course of the last year and a half. They rewrote the rule book on when they can cite on an instance by instance basis, which is basically a big penalty multiplier. Rather than a single citation with a single penalty for, not wearing a hard hat, now we can cite you for every employee that we observe not wearing a hard hat. And they've had this policy for a long time where they could do this in what they call egregious circumstances, willful plus. They've now expanded it to serious, some other than serious circumstances, even repeat, even though the policy doesn't say that. We're seeing in the field that that is what the agency is doing. And then likewise, they expanded the severe violator enforcement program to make it easier to tar an employer as a bad actor. And that carries important consequences also, lots of follow-up inspections and sister facility inspections. And you can see in the less than one full year that OSHA had that new authority to characterize an employer as a severe violator, they like tripled the number of employers that got dumped into this program. So the question, we're thinking about internally is what happens to policies like that? What happens to policies like OSHA's very deliberate approach to finding and characterizing more violations as repeat violations by looking further back in time, looking across facilities of a single corporate entity? And when we had this webinar, when we had this kind of discussion, 8 years ago, as we walked into the Trump administration the first time around, my expectation was these things are gone, right? We're gonna revert to the old policies on how to find repeat violations. We're gonna eliminate, severe violator enforcement program was a budding new ugly program, a decade ago that maybe that thing's gonna get scrapped. And none of that happened. There was no rolling back of those kinds of policies during the prior Trump administration. So I would, am I going to sit here today and say we can expect these things to continue because 8 years ago and for the 4 years that followed, none of these kinds of things changed? I don't think we can make that prediction because for the same reason I keep saying, maybe a confirmed head of OSHA would have pared some of those things back, but we never saw that. Do I think that someone's going to come in, a nominee from Trump that gets confirmed and is going to roll back emphasis programs, is going to roll back instance by instance citations, is going to pare back the severe violator enforcement program? I think it's much more likely to happen this go round than the last go round, but these things have a tendency to stick, right? It's not like a regulation where there's strong feelings by a new administration that we don't agree with this rule, we are going to change this rule. These kinds of things tend to stick, right? When they expanded what is a repeat violation, that stuck, and I'm not sure that that's going to change ever again. Penalty authority rising year over year over year, that has a tendency to just continue in its course. So I'd like to see some of this stuff pared back, and we'll certainly have conversations with whoever the leadership and decision makers are about things like severe violator enforcement program, which I think is a deeply flawed program. But these things have a tendency to linger regardless of those pendulum swings, unlike numbers of inspections, size of individual enforcement actions. I don't know. My prediction is that these things survive the next administration. I don't know what others think.
Yeah, I think that a lot is going to depend on who's in that seat, right? And if it's a former management side OSHA lawyer, like if you were appointed the head of OSHA, I think I know SVEP would be the first thing cut, given your public statements about SVEP. If it's a corporate person, like if it was Scott Mugno and he comes from FedEx Ground, which is a good safety program, and they hadn't had a lot of heartache with instance by instance, then maybe that's not his priority. right? And so I think a lot of it's going to depend on the life experiences of whoever lands in that chair and what they want to focus on. I wouldn't be surprised to see a rollback to the older repeats criteria, 3 years instead of 5 years. But
I have to take some blame for that because I argued the triumph case for the government in the Second Circuit that kind of got rid of that 3 year. So sorry about that, guys. But
Yeah, now it's a 55-year look back.
exactly. I think I got no look back period.
You
which
got
was
no
really-
look back.
Yeah. So
Get
yeah.
stuck with the 5 years.
Sorry, they were writing my checks at the time. But yeah, I mean, just on the flip side, Aaron, just to sort of close this loop on the enforcement policy, whether you guys think whether or not the SFAP and, you know, other kind of punitive, I'll call them programs, go away, the other side of the coin is maybe we'll see more from the cooperative program side and compliance assistance side.
Yeah,
You
I mean,
think, yeah.
you know, this is one of the things that you do actually see a big pendulum swing from administration to administration is the value that the administrations place on VPP in particular, but these compliance assistance programs. And I remember vividly during the Obama administration that they were writing memo after memo talking about how it's too easy to get into VPP, too hard to kick people out, and we're going to write some new rules to be able to remove employers more easily from these programs.
And in Republican administrations, it's too hard to get in and too easy to get out.
Right. And so I think we probably will see maybe a reallocation of existing budget dollars to support more work on VPP and other cooperative programs and things like that. I think that's probably a pretty safe bet for the next 4 years. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a really successful program that OSHA has operated for many years. Create a nice incentive for employers to take safety more seriously, invest in that. And I think we can see some wins from that. And I do think that that's likely to happen regardless of who's in that seat. That pendulum swings pretty consistently as you move from a Republican to a Democratic administration and vice versa.
I mean, I know from my conversations with people on the cooperative program side that they would like to see more budgets,
Yep.
more budget dollars, even in a Democratic administration where enforcement very much gets, I don't know what the percentage of the funding is, but it's pretty significant disparity.
Yeah.
And so I think you'll see that level off more.
Worry what will happen with the policy review that the agency's currently doing on VPP. You know, this administration has spent the last year and a half looking at the VPP program with the goal of modernizing it and creating a greater incentive for more companies to want to join and creating a process and policy where they have greater reach. And whether that happens now under this administration or not, we don't know. But it seems like those goals of this administration may be aligned with what we would traditionally see in a Republican administration, which is a broader emphasis and a greater expansion of the preeminent sort of flagship cooperative program of the agency, VPP.
Yeah,
And SHARP to some degree.
If they release that policy review in the next month, which probably they'll do, right? Get this done before, I don't know if you think they're going to finish it. I think we will probably see as a part of that a little bit more around the off-ramp, right? Because I think they want people, you've benefited from this for a long time. You don't need it anymore. Let's clear you out and make room for new entities to join. That I think you would probably see. There's daylight between the current administration's view of that and what I would expect the next administration's view is that there's no term limit on being part of VPP. I think the current administration, my expectation is that is a finding from this review. If it sees the light of day, is to try and term employers out of that program. And I don't think that would be adopted by a future Trump administration. But
I know you all are closer to this than I am and may have more inside information, but isn't one of the other things that they're talking about other recognitions like ISO that gets you some benefits, which I think would absolutely be something that the next administration would sign on for, right?
Right. There's some maybe the idea of like VPP light with, gradations or, a process where you're moving towards VPP and getting certain benefits, which does sound like a pretty positive opportunity that a Trump administration might implement for sure.
And we represent a bunch of very good safety conscious companies that are actually moving away from VPP, going to ISO 45001. They feel that it's a better system. So if OSHA could, understand what is driving people to move away from VPP and to 45001, and build that into their cooperative program, that might be a very useful thing for this next administration to consider.
Well, I think that's where a lot of this is interconnected though, right? So if ISO certification means you're exempt from emphasis program inspections, that could be a really, nice plum for those folks. But if the emphasis programs go away, then is there less incentive to do that, right? I think most of our clients would say, no, that's not why we're doing it. But that obviously for certain employers is why they do it.
Yeah.
The high road and the low road employers. I noticed that we replaced bad actors. We replaced bad actors at the last OSHA conference with low road employers. So I just want to make sure we're using the right, agency terminology. I also want to make sure we're moving because we have 13 minutes left to cover all rulemaking and states, and there are like 50 of those. So, we should go to Kate to talk about OSHA rulemaking.
Well, the good news, Scott, is this won't take long. I think we can probably, Rachel, I'll give you 10. I'll take 3. No, I'm teasing. We don't know, just like with enforcement, we do not know what will happen with OSHA rulemaking over the next 4 years. If past is prologue, and if there is an assistant secretary who is confirmed, who is similar to a typical previous Republican administrations, rulemaking will slow down. I think we can probably pretty safely predict that at minimum, rulemaking will slow down. It may not come to a screeching halt if we have a Bush type assistant secretary, or a situation like we had with Lauren Sweat and the first Trump administration. If in fact, though, we have a more aggressive or radical, I guess you could say, assistant secretary more aligned with President-elect Trump, I think rulemaking that is proactive, meaning to establish more rules, will come to a pretty loud and screeching halt. I don't think we'll see much activity at all in the way of new rules. However, there will be a fair amount of rulemaking activity, I expect, because there will be a lot of deregulatory activity. You all may recall that in the first Trump administration, President Trump, and I think first day in office, issued an executive order that indicated, and this is, of course, executive branch wide, not just OSHA or Department of Labor, that for every new regulation, 2 regulations had to be withdrawn. It was the administration's efforts to decrease the administrative state, decrease the size of the executive branch regulatory world. Now what we understand is on day 1, we'll have a new executive order from President Trump that will require 10 withdrawals or elimination of rules for every 1 new regulation. Obviously, a much more expansive effort to deregulate. So if we have an assistant secretary who follows that lead, if that actually happens, then we'll see a lot of activity, probably pretty immediately, that is designed to eliminate and narrow the scope of OSHA's rule, 1910. The big question is, what is going to go if there is anything new? Scott helped put these slides together and put a bullet just before you move on, Scott. This last bullet on this slide talks about even outside what's going to happen with this new assistant secretary if we get one. The Supreme Court in this last term issued some pretty landscape changing decisions that are designed, all work together to really sort of narrow the authority of agencies and the incentive agencies have to promulgate new regulations. With Loper Bright and the change of the regulatory authority of the statutory authority of the agency to promulgate regulations, we really are already in a world where there's much less authority for the agency to promulgate new regs. So
Yeah, and just one thing on that too. I mean, the deregulation, it's not like you snap your fingers and a reg goes. You actually have to engage in rulemaking to get rid of the rule. So to say that there are going to be 10 rulemakings to get rid of existing rules for any one you put forward basically says there's no rulemaking.
No rule.
Like there's no, I mean, these can take years, as we all know. The infectious disease standard was started in 2014 under Obama, and we're still waiting. So, that's a decade.
although we may not be waiting for long,
Maybe
because
not.
we are hearing, word on the street is that we are going to see this administration move forward and finalize the infectious disease standard before the end of the administration, likely in January. Now, in the regulatory agenda that was just issued, like on Monday of this week, the agency established the date by which they were going to issue this final rule for the infectious disease standard. It is the annual agenda, what do they call it? The
Uniform regulatory agenda.
uniform regulatory agenda is
Unified, excuse me,
notoriously-
unified.
notoriously off. The dates are never met. However, we expect and we are hearing that this administration is in fact going to meet the January deadline and issue a final rule. So one thing that's happening is the Biden administration is trying to pump out as many regulations as it can. One of them is likely going to be infectious disease. Infectious disease is not going to cover, the scope of it is not going to be for, all employers. It will be focused on healthcare, correctional facilities, drug rehab facilities, but it will cover medical clinics in all likelihood in manufacturing facilities. So it will have some impact on a large swath of employers. In addition to that standard, walking working surfaces is likely going to be proposed in January, and we're going to deal with that stair rail issue that has been the bane of some of you who are on the phone existence over the last couple of years. So we may have a clarification on that will be helpful to, I think, employers. And then there are a couple of, retaliation rules that are going to be promulgated as interim final rules before the inauguration that are going to, as I understand it, Scott, this is more your world than ours, but are going to sort of standardize the procedures for bringing whistleblower cases. And so we don't have time in this webinar to talk about that. But I guess in the end, what are we going to see? We're going to see a bunch of rules come or proposals move forward in the next month. And then we're going to see a lot of deregulatory action. And I think that's likely to be the case regardless of who is the next standard bearer. The couple of rules before, Rachel, I turn this over to you, a couple of things I just want to point out about the existing priority rules of this administration, heat and emergency response. The heat standard, you guys all know, I'm sure some of you are in our coalition, it's in proposed form. I cannot imagine a world in which that standard is finalized in this next administration. We've had some discussion and some people are reading some tea leaves saying, oh no, it's going to go forward because we're going to have a Secretary of Labor who is going to be very pro-union. I don't think it matters how pro-union, that standard is not going anywhere, in my humble opinion. But it does exist as a proposal. So if we have a Bush-like assistant secretary, the emphasis program for heat may stick. General duty clause citations may continue to be issued for heat. Employers can look to the proposal to, establish their voluntary programs or beef up their voluntary programs. So that's, I think, what's going to happen there. And on emergency response, that rule, the hearings were held. It's at OMB. As I said, it's likely to come out. And then I'd say probably one of the most controversial standards that the Biden administration issued, the worker walkaround standard. I think is going to be number one deregulatory rulemaking that we'll see, because employers do not like it. And I think there's a lot of political sensitivity around it.
It's possible that for worker walk around, just to flag that one, because that is, highly controversial rulemaking, that there's not even going to be a need for a deregulatory action. There's a legal challenge pending on that
Good
case.
point.
And the Trump
Yeah.
administration could come in and just decline to defend the legal challenge. And if they, mount no defense of the legality of that rulemaking, that's pending in the Fifth Circuit, or it's actually in the district court, I think, in Texas, moved to the Fifth Circuit, moved to the Supreme Court. I think that rule is dead meat. And it's, regardless of the defense that the Department of Labor might mount of the authority to issue that rule, I think it's, if there's no defense at all, I think that rule will get wiped out through the judiciary, and there won't even need to be rulemaking to deregulate. I do think there'll be rulemaking to deregulate or to modify or to weaken the electronic record keeping rule. That's been a pendulum swing issue, that if folks are impacted by the more detailed level of injury data that you have to submit now, some employers have to submit. I'm happy to talk with you about that offline, but I expect that there will be a paring back of that as well.
And I just have to jump in. I think if anyone was hoping to see the revised Lotto hazardous energy control rule, obviously that the OSHA stopped working on the revisions to that rule middle of this year. I know a lot of our clients were hoping that rule actually would be released and there would be recognition of alternative methods. So that is one area where I think the regulated community may very well push for that rulemaking to be completed, because I think it actually benefits industry and advances safety, more importantly.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, both Lotto modernization and possibly the lead rule, where there's uniform agreement that the removal level for lead in blood should be lowered. And if this administration will do that and not take on the more controversial parts of the lead standard, that may be another one that moves forward, because there'll be, across the board support for it.
So this slide, I think we should have, I guess, revised the title, not wither, but WITHER populism then. Like, we're saying the walk around rule is dead because candidate Trump's support for unions or courting of unions isn't actually going to carry the day on that one, even though it's heavily union backed. But moving on so that we can get to Rachel, and what is up with these state OSHA plans? I thought OSHA was a federal agency. Please explain.
So anytime, well, of course, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, it's a federal statute, but it allows for certified state plans. And we have many state plans here in the United States, and some of our favorites. I know that you call Cal OSHA aggressive. I call it everyone's favorite state plan. We're going to see these state plans probably have a lot more aggressiveness and step up and to fill a vacuum that we might see at the federal level. And actually, when we talk about this, we don't want to just include the OSH state plans. We're also looking at state legislatures as well as these OSH plans to fill what may potentially be a federal decline. And I mean, I think that is our big, bold prediction from today's webinar, is that we will see a decline at the federal level. And we've already seen in some states, states that are aggressive already, like California, to have their state legislatures step up in times when they feel that the agency is not moving fast enough or not doing enough. So, I think that we will potentially see kind of a twofold increase. So our state plans that are already in place, and that may be not only enforcement, rulemaking, but also we will see some state legislatures in places where that might be federal states take on some more action around workplace safety. We'll talk about a little bit in a minute about, and just go real quick back to the last slide. Scott, but as we said, Cal OSHA will continue to claim its title as the leader of workplace safety in the country. They take that very seriously. During COVID, they had that banner waving, and we'll continue to see that in California. And we'll see, as California increases rulemaking and enforcement, the things that they do at rulemaking, we'll certainly see get potentially picked up from other state plans. And the other states like Washington and Oregon, Michigan, Nevada, Illinois, and New York, that we could also see some increase in as well, that are already, some of these that are state plans are already pretty aggressive. As a lot of us on this call know, Washington is becoming one of the most aggressive state plans. It issues more willfuls than California does. Easily, it's better staffed than California. Oregon, it's one that's been coming more and more aggressive. It also has the highest penalties in the country, and they aren't afraid to use that. And by the way, that penalty structure was not something that Oregon OSHA put in place. That came through the legislature. And another example of that, that kind of duality that we're seeing in a more aggressive state legislatures picking up. Nevada, been a little bit of a dark horse kind of coming through the last year or so and being more aggressive in its enforcement. It just released its heat illness plan, and we can probably just head over to the next slide where we'll see, state plans have had a emphasis on heat illness prevention, and Nevada now being the latest example of that, following what Maryland just released as well. And, anybody who has read through all of these plans, rules, one of the biggest things that always sticks out to me about them is, how different they are from each other. And as Kate was mentioning that, we likely won't see the heat illness standard move through at the federal level. What does that mean? Now we have this hodgepodge of rules at the state level that if you are an employer that has to operate in multiple states, and now you have to have a plan that is compliant in each of these states. So there's certainly an argument to be made that, the lack of the federal rule doesn't necessarily make it easier for employers, to comply. As someone who has, worked on lots of policies for, multi-state employers, it's quite a headache to have to align all of these. And that's not to say that even with a federal rule, states can't be stricter, but at least I think that there are some states like, potentially Nevada, where we probably, that's a pretty, depending on who you talk to, some will call it a reasonable heat rule. Some will call it an egregiously bad heat rule. I'll let you decide who feels what. But a federal, it's much below what the federal rule looks like. And if that was in place, it would actually be a more aggressive than what Nevada has in place now.
I mean, not to once again bring up COVID, but I think we all remember trying to comply across jurisdictions with every not only state, but municipality, hamlet, burg, ville that came out with its own, COVID mask regulation. And, just to have that kind of diversity is certainly difficult for multi-jurisdictional employers. I'm looking at Maryland out my office window right now. So if I walk across the street, I mean, DC doesn't have one. We're not a state, but, Maryland has its own thing, and the different standards for walking 20 feet, it can be interesting.
Yeah, one pro tip about the Minnesota climate rule is that there's also minimum temperature requirements. So I defended a warehouse that was cited for not keeping it warm enough. So that's the only law in the country that I'm aware of that sets that minimum threshold. So if you have operations in Minnesota, their whole in Minnesota OSHA has become, I think, pretty aggressive. They've passed a number of interesting. There's some warehouse specific regulations on the books there as well. One other thing that just to mention, right? This is that there are blue states that are preparing for potential Armageddon at federal agencies like DOL, and there are whispers that we're hearing that Illinois is considering going state plan status if Governor Pritzker believes that Fed OSHA has abdicated its responsibility to protect workers in Illinois. Now, Illinois is a hybrid state. It has a state plan, but only for government employees. But there is something of an infrastructure there. There are presumably some folks that have done workplace safety inspections. So that is kind of the wild card. Will there be states that opt out of the federal system because the federal system is not doing enough as opposed? So that's something that will be interesting.
New York is another one to keep an eye on as possibly trying to make that move as well. And then you end up with, like Rachel's talking about, a patchwork of different laws and regulations all around the country, which is, probably more challenging to deal with. But it's that or the pendulum swing every 4 or 8 years. So, that's why you need OSHA lawyers. Things are constantly changing, and that's what we're here for. So,
and just another, quick example of an area to watch that has increased in the past couple of years. We expect to continue to increase, and is the workplace violence prevention. California's rule, New York's rule. And, just to note, these are all non-healthcare workplace violence laws that came, again, through state legislatures. These did not, this isn't a Cal OSHA rule. New York, a Fed OSHA state, these came through the legislature. So we're certainly seeing an increase in state legislatures flexing in those ways. And then just lastly, some other potential priorities to keep a lookout for: infectious disease. For general industry, Kate mentioned it. For, it's not just healthcare at the federal level. I call it healthcare and healthcare maybe adjacent. If you are in California, that may look really similar to the aerosol transmissible disease standard that we already have here. So stay tuned to see if those actually match up. But Cal OSHA will be allegedly has a draft of the infectious disease standard for general industry that is meant to replace the COVID-19 non-emergency rule that is sunsetting early 2025. And maybe we see that picked up in other states as well. So that is one that, again, once California lays the blueprint out, it kind of is up for grabs in other areas. And then, we've already kind of talked about some of the concerns about when we see more activity at that state level is just harder for employers. And we're also seeing some expedited rulemaking in places like Washington to push through some stuff before we see a transition at the federal level.
Eric, I'm kicking it back to you to close this out. 10 minutes late.
Let's just close it out. And
Scott, you're new. We never finish on time. So.
10 minutes late is 15 minutes early. Congratulations, team, for a very efficient program today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for joining us all year long. This is, one of my favorite things that we do as a team is this webinar series. It's a lot of hard work, but it's great to connect with you all and great to connect internally as a team, putting these together. We learn a lot putting them together. And I know we hear from you all every year that this is a valuable resource for you. So we're glad to do it. And we're looking forward to next year. There will be, I know you're all sitting on the edge of your seat waiting for the announcement for the 2025 OSHA webinar series and our companion Cal OSHA webinar series and our companion MSHA Mine Safety webinar series. And we're sitting around the water cooler talking about topics for next year. If you have ideas, share those with us. And we look forward to joining you again in your living rooms in 2025, talking about workplace safety and all the fun and interesting things that are happening in our little slice of the universe. So happy holidays, everybody, and stay safe. And thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um,